Hello class, this is a review of Introduction to the Plant Kingdom focusing on the bryophytes. Let's get started. Your outline is as follows. First we'll do an introduction to life histories, which is to say how do plants use an alternation of generations life cycle. Then we'll say a few words about an introduction to the evolution of primitive plants. And then finally, I will present an updated phylogeny for the liverworts, the hornworts, and the mosses. In plants, a complete life cycle involving sexual reproduction has an alternation of generations between a diploid sporophyte phase and a haploid gametophyte phase. We can see this relationship between sporophyte and gametophyte, in which the sporophyte generation is made up of diploid cells and the gametophyte generation is made up of haploid cells. Some part of the gametophyte will eventually produce gametes, and once those gametes fuse, fertilization occurs. After fertilization, we go into the diploid generation as soon as that zygote is formed. The zygote develops into a sporophyte generation, and in some part of the sporophyte generation, the spore mother cells, or sporocytes, will be formed, and those cells will undergo meiosis to produce the spores. We could therefore say that plant life cycles is this relationship between two cell types that ultimately lead to tissues and eventually to organs. The sporophyte generation is composed of diploid cells, and the sporophyte produces spores by meiosis. The gametophyte generation is made up of haploid cells, and the gametophyte produces gametes by mitosis. In this figure, it shows us the alternation of generations again. Remember, the diploid sporophyte generation produces haploid spores through meiosis. The spores develop into a haploid gametophyte generation that produces haploid gametes by mitosis. The fusion of these gametes results in a diploid zygote that develops into the sporophyte plant. In this figure, it presents three variations on the alternation of generations plant life cycle. This lecture focuses on the bryophytes, in which the sporophyte is dependent on the gametophyte for its entire life. Therefore, we could say that the bryophytes, including the mosses, are gametophyte dominant. Another variation on this alternation of generations is one that is seen in the seedless vascular plants. Seedless vascular plants are sporophyte dominant, and they have a gametophyte generation that's very small and independent. In fact, it's not even attached to the parent plant. We see this variation in the seedless vascular plants, including the ferns. And finally, the most sophisticated variation is what we see in the seed-producing plants, including the gymnosperms and the angiosperms. In these plants, they are also sporophyte dominant, just like the seedless vascular plants, but the gametophyte is highly reduced and completely dependent upon the sporophyte. In the angiosperms, we see the gametophyte being completely enclosed inside of tissue, further protecting it from the outside world. Now, we believe that one lineage of modern-day green algae and all four lineages of modern-day plants share a common ancestor. And the evidence for this is that plants and this modern-day green algae share the following characteristics, including they all have chlorophyll A and B, as well as carotenoids. They have starch as a food reserve. They have cellulose in their cell walls, and finally they form a cell plate during cell division. So what do plants need that algae do not? Well, first off, life on land is harsh, so the plants on land are going to need roots in order to absorb water. Plants on land will need stems and leaves to support their photosynthetic parts. Plants on land will need a cuticle in order to protect themselves from both water loss and ultraviolet light radiation. And finally, plants on land need a way to protect their embryo. The embryo could easily dry out otherwise, and then the plant would never be able to reproduce. Many biologists consider containment as one of the most advanced adaptations in the seed-producing plants. By containing your zygote within tissue, you're keeping it very safe so that it cannot be damaged from the outside world. Some of the structures that play a role in this containment include producing gametes in gametangia and spores in sporangia. Also, in the most advanced plants, the zygote develops into the embryo while fully contained inside the female plant. Now we can introduce you to the bryophytes. These are the types of plants that we believe are derived from the earliest plants. The bryophytes are similar to algae in that they need sperm to swim to eggs and therefore require water for fertilization. The bryophytes have no vascular tissue, or roots, or seeds. However, like other more modern land plants, the bryophytes do produce a waxy cuticle to prevent dehydration, and they do have embryos that are contained within the mother plant in order to protect it, specifically inside the female gametangium, even after fertilization. There are over 20,000 species of bryophytes on our planet today, and it includes the following groups, including mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. The bryophytes occupy a wide range of habitats, everywhere from damp forests to scorching hot rocks in the sun. We even find bryophytes in places such as alpine slopes, in which they can only reproduce when those frozen slopes melt for a very short time period in the summer. Bryophytes are found everywhere from sea level to 15,000 feet or higher in places like the Himalaya mountain range. Bryophytes often have a mycorrhizal fungus associated with their rhizoids. Because they don't have true roots, the mycorrhizal fungus is essential for helping them absorb ions and minerals from the soil. Peat mosses are ecologically important in the bog systems of the world, particularly in northern Europe, are where lots of peat moss bogs are found. And there's also cool things such as luminous mosses. They're found in caves, and they have structural cells on the surface of their bodies that allows them to reflect light and amplify light in a otherwise dark cave. Now, none of the bryophytes have true xylem or phloem, but many do have hydroids for water conduction. Therefore, most of the water is absorbed directly through the surface. And as I mentioned previously, to reproduce sexually, all of the bryophytes must have rainwater or another source of external water to splash the sperm to the egg. Now, in mosses, the part that makes up the green part of the plant is a major part of the gametophyte generation. And the gametophyte is going to play a role in producing gametes by mitosis. On the other hand, the sporophyte grows out of the gametophyte, and it is wholly dependent on that gametophyte for the entire life of the plant. And remember, the sporophyte produces spores by meiosis. Currently, there are several accepted phylogenies for the proposed tree of life when we're looking at the plants. And what really is uncertain right now is the bryophyte lineages. We believe they may have arisen independently from an ancestral green algae, and so there still is uncertainty as to how they are related to the other plants on the tree of life. We can finally launch into our first group phylum Marcantiophyta, which includes the liverworts. There's approximately 8,000 species worldwide, and they are very common. They tend to have flattened, lobed bodies that are referred to as the thalli. Now, just like other plants in the bryophytes, the gametophyte stage develops from spores, and when the spores germinate, they typically produce an immature gametophyte that is referred to as a protonema. The main genus to know for our class is Marcantia, and they all look basically the same. They have a thick thallus that forks dichotomously as it grows. In this figure, it shows us a cross-section through the Marcantia thallus. It shows us many of the cells that we've come to know, such as parenchyma cells and chlorenchyma cells, but notice there are none of the types of more complicated cells and tissues that we learned in the advanced plants. This figure shows us the sexual life cycle for Marcantia and that relationship between the gametophyte and sporophyte generation. Remember, Marcantia is gametophyte dominant. In order for Marcantia to do sexual reproduction, it must produce gametangia on gametophores. And for Marcantia, we use some unique language. For the male structure, it's referred to as an antheridiophore. The antheridiophore contains the antheridium that produces the sperm. On the other hand, the female reproductive part is on the archegoniophore, which contains the archegonium that produces the egg. In these micrographs, it shows us the male and female producing structures on the antheridiophore and archegoniophore, respectively. Once fertilization occurs, we have the formation of a zygote. This begins the sporophyte generation, and in Marcantia, the sporophyte grows directly out of the gametophyte. Marcantia is also capable of asexual reproduction, and it does so by special little discs of tissue that live in cups. And these little discs are called gemma. These gemma can be splashed away, and then they can grow into a new thallus by mitosis. In this figure, it gives us yet another view of the archegonial head and the antheridial head that produce the eggs and sperm on a thalloid liverwort. Next up, we have phylum Anthoceratophyta, which is the hornworts. And they are not as interesting as the other groups, so I don't focus on these a lot in this class. But they are unique in that the mature sporophytes look like miniature greenish-blackish rods that grow right out of the thallus. Also interesting is the thalloid gametophyte has cells that contain only one large chloroplasts, and they can do asexual reproduction by fragmentation. There are only about 100 species worldwide, so there are not a lot of these. They aren't found in California at all. We only see hornworts typically in more tropical parts of our world. Finally, let's look at phylum Bryophyta, which is the mosses. The mosses come in 3 different groups: the peat mosses, the true mosses, and the rock mosses. Now, the leaves of the moss gametophyte aren't like the leaves that we're used to. The mosses have no mesophyll, no stomata, and no veins. Instead, they've got very primitive types of photosynthetic organs in which the blades are nearly always one cell thick and never lobed or divided, and they initially are formed in 3 ranks, usually ending up to appear as a spiral or in a twisted formation. The moss stoma is unique because it only has 1 guard cell. There are more than 10,000 species of moss in over 700 genera. So while we might not think much of moss, they are actually 2 times as diverse as the mammals. Now, they don't have any real roots, so they have rhizoids that anchor the plant, and water absorption is done by osmosis, since There's no roots with root hairs, as we have learned previously. Now, in order to do sexual reproduction, the mosses have antheridia and archegonia produced at the terminal end of the gametophytes. In this figure, it shows us the archegonium on a moss. So that is going to be the structure at the end of the gametophyte that produces the egg. In this figure, it shows us the antheridium that produces the sperm, again found at the end of the gametophyte of the moss. In this life cycle, it shows us the relationship between the gametophyte generation and the sporophyte generation. And remember, in all of the bryophytes, the sporophyte completely is dependent upon the gametophyte because these organisms are gametophyte dominant and they require water for fertilization. All right, well, that's our brief overview of the bryophytes. We now should understand all parts of the alternation of generations life cycle. We should know the basic features and characteristics of primitive plants as the evolution of plants occurred on our planet. And finally, we should know the updated phylogeny of the liverworts, hornworts, and mosses, including their key characteristics and life cycles where applicable. Thank you so much for listening. Please email me with any questions.